is I'm going to open it up to a question. I'll give a few of you an opportunity to chime in at the beginning, and then we'll move into our study of text, which is I want to pose a question, which is really a question driving what generated this this interest in doing this session at this particular time on Martin Buber, in the time when we're talking about social distancing. And the question is really, what is it that we value about the face-to-face community, about community where we have a physical and social presence with other people, right? What is it that we value about being able to be in the same place with people where we call that community? Because I think right now, given what we're experiencing is in a very sudden and unexpected way, we have been deprived of the face-to-face element of community. We've been deprived of the direct contact with other people. Now there's a very significant interpersonal and psychological element to that, but there's also a kind of broader social and communal element to that as well. And that's really what I want to, it's that second part that I really want to focus on today, though the kind of, you can't really fully separate the psychological from the communal, and I would say you can't really separate the communal from the spiritual in a way that maybe sometimes we're used to thinking about. If someone wants to chime in, if someone wants to just feel free to kind of unmute yourself and say hello. Just say your name really quickly and just give me a sentence or two. And what is it about the face-to-face community that you value? You can just unmute yourself and say hello.
Well, this is Ellen Werner, and the immediacy of seeing something, of seeing a person rather. I can't even identify people anymore. I've been alone for almost 2 weeks. But watching someone's face when you talk to them, or seeing their body move, or just being in the presence of a person is, I think, essential to being human. It's very bizarre being isolated. And it makes me have another feeling about zoos.
Okay. I realize that yeah, if people are having difficulty with managing the Zoom platform, I understand, but so we're just gonna make sure you're not sharing your screen with us. That's something to avoid. Yeah, thank you, Ellen. Does someone else want to chime in? Just sharing a thought on what is it that's valuable. That was a very beautiful thought, Ellen. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Sofia Grandakowska, and I'm happy to be today present on this online lecture about Martin Buber. Regarding your question, it could be said a lot, but for me, the first association is the direct contact. You see visually the person, and at the same time, you see and you feel the gestures, eyes, which are actually expression of our inner world, or as we used to say, inner soul. So in short, that's what I would like to share about your question. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. That's very beautiful. Yeah, I see. Yeah, Steven, is that Steven? Just, you gotta, I'll unmute you. I've unmuted you. So, or I think I did. I think you have to unmute yourself to speak up. There you go.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes. Great.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'd like to take another tact. Since this is a conversation about Jewish community as well as individual community, Jewish community over the millennia has often been at a distance. And community has been achieved not necessarily through face-to-face communication. In fact, it most often wasn't, but it was through correspondence, through travelers who would carry stories or questions from one place to another. I just read a fascinating family history called Family Papers by Stein, and it deals with a Sephardic family in Salonika from the early 19th century to the present, which scattered all over the world and were connected, although not face-to-face. So that face-to-face is nice, but it may not be absolutely necessary.
That's very interesting. I'm going to want to sort of come back to that. I'll just say right off the bat that you know, when Buber talks about community, he's not thinking in quite those terms. And so it'd be interesting to see sort of what would we make of what Stephen is saying in light of what Buber is saying, right? Like, in other words, is that a criticism of Buber? Is that a limitation on Buber? Are we talking about two different things and how they might then interact with each other in a dynamic way? I think that would be something I want to have us think about as we go through the Buber material. You know, I'd love to take one more comment on just this question of like the significance of faith, the face-to-face and community before we dive into our texts. Anyone want to jump in there? So I see a hand. You have to unmute yourself to just jump in and speak. Yeah.
Yeah. My name is Naftali Minsky. Let's talk about something else than seeing each other. Let's talk about touching each other. I don't know that anybody can explain exactly why touching is important. We know it is physiologically important. We are developed to touch. Similarly, not seeing each other, you can have a various explanation. You can see the eyes, you can see the face, you can see the movement. Fundamentally, we are built for that. So to say that we can create, we can create large community. Jews has very large community which are different from each other. But the small community, family, friends, and so on, we are built to see that. And therefore we lose that fundamental part of our psyche.
Yeah, that's very beautiful. Yeah, I mean, I think it was Sophia, was it, who mentioned gestures as well. And I think there's something about whether it's physical touch, but also the way in which physical gestures come across, even if there isn't physical contact between the two. In other words, even if there isn't physical touching between two people, but the way that gestures come across as a form of communication. And I think that's another thing to think about here too, is, you know, I noticed this just doing some of my teaching this week on Zoom, that a lot is lost in the subtlety of face-to-face conversation when it goes to Zoom. That is, that being present with somebody and seeing gestures and seeing facial expressions, or perhaps having direct physical contact with them, is really something quite different than what we normally have. And I think that something really is lost in that, in terms of the way we communicate and connect to one another. So with that said, and I really appreciate beginning with some of these comments, I want to go into some of the text that we have. It was not, I just want to say, by way of clarification, it was not required that one prepare the texts in advance. You may get a little bit more out of what we're going to do if you looked at them in advance. And also there's a short reading, again, not required, which I actually think you may enjoy reading after this session to get a deeper sense of what Buber is talking about. For those who are not familiar, so first of all, my name is Bill Plevan. I'm a rabbi. I have a doctorate in Jewish studies, and I wrote my dissertation on Martin Buber, and I'm working away on a book on the topic. And I'm thinking a lot about what Buber has to say about community and the role that direct contact with people has in shaping community, and thinking about community not only as a social entity, but community as a religious aspiration. And I think Buber really thinks of creating community and building community as a religious aspiration, something that we as Jews seek to do, not just for the sake of the benefits or the instrumental benefits or social benefits of community, but because there's something intrinsically valuable about being together with others and sharing something with others and sharing our life with others, and that having a real community that is not just a group of people who live together, but a group of people who genuinely share with one another, having that real community, Buber understands as a religious aspiration. And dare I say, I think it's a very helpful way of thinking about what it is that we value about the various kinds of communities that we're in particular, our own synagogue community at Anshe Chesed, where, I mean, we take it for granted that it's a religious community, but I would say that more importantly is that the building of community together is itself a kind of religious aspiration in and of itself. And we might think about, how this thought of Buber's might impact the way we think about that. So the first thing I want to say is I've divided this up into two sections of texts. One is about crisis, and the other is about community. Now, there's been a lot of talk in the recent weeks about us going through a crisis. I'm actually not trying to make a particular equation between Buber's understanding of a crisis going on in the world, which I'll explain what he means by that, and our current crisis. I'm not saying that they're really the same. So I just want to be clear about that from the beginning. And when Buber, to explain, when Buber talks about crisis, he's talking about a challenge that he sees in the modern world in particular, which is that the modern world exhibits this tendency towards greater social separation. Now, Buber's hardly unique in making this observation. Many sociologists and historians have noted it since the 19th century, at least, if not earlier. But certainly with the advancement of industrialization and urbanization in Europe, in Western Europe, and then in other parts of the world subsequently, many thinkers have become concerned about the consequences, the social consequences and the psychological and spiritual consequences of people living more and more separate, or in the case of urban settings, living with large numbers of people with whom they don't really have relationships, right? Which is a very common sort of urban phenomenon. And Buber stands as one of these thinkers who's concerned with this question. And one thing I should just say is, before we look at these texts also as a way of qualification, is that Buber is in no way suggesting that we go back to some pre-modern reality. Every time he talks about it, he does sometimes sound like he's romanticizing the past. And in a certain sense, he is a romantic thinker. But even if he may be romanticizing the past to some degree, he is not at all suggesting that we go back to the past, or that we somehow shift modernity towards being more like the past. He doesn't want us to go back. He really wants us to be aware of the limitations of our own reality and to think about the past in ways that might help us open up new ways of thinking about the future. He's really much more of a future-oriented thinker. He wants us to be, but he also doesn't want, I think what he's really trying to avoid is the kind of narrative where we just assume that modern life is better than pre-modern life. He wants to say that we have lost something in the advancement of technology and the advancement of economic and social life towards greater and greater complexity, and that we have to be aware of what we may have lost and try to then restore what we've lost, but not in a backward-looking way, but rather in a future-looking way. Right? So when we read him, I want us to just keep that in mind. So first of all, I want to look at some of these texts where he talks about a crisis of humanity in modern life. So we're looking at this first text here. I'm just sort of briefly highlighting it with my Microsoft Word function there. And so he says that the first factor, he talks about two factors. I'll sort of unpack that a little bit in a moment. But the first factor in the modern crisis is the increasing decay of old organic forms of the direct life of man with man. Such forms are the family, union and work, the community and village and in town. And then he says, in their outer structure, many of the old organic forms remained as before, but they decayed inwardly. They steadily lost meaning and spiritual power. So what he's saying here is that basically since, he's thinking primarily about since the French Revolution, right? Since about 1789, and you have a significant restructuring of modern political societies in Europe, and then subsequently in North America and then in other places around the world, you have these old organic forms of life. Now, he talks about the family, he talks about community and village, and when he says union and work, he's not talking about labor unions, he means people working together in organic sorts of ways, right? The way in which peasants might have worked the land together, in which ownership arrangements were much more what's the word I'm looking for? Much more informal, right? Much more informal ideas about who owns what land, and that people might work together on common projects together without any particular concern of individual benefit. The idea is that people derive their individual economic benefit from working together in various forms of ways. And there were smaller towns and villages in which people lived and may have shared resources, but also just knew each other in a more intimate sort of way. And he says that even as the modern life became more complex in the 19th century and the early 20th century, these old organic forms of life may have still existed, but they decayed inwardly. That is, they became weaker and weaker. They became less and less a focus of people's lives, and fewer people lived in those kinds of societies, right? And I think we can say that process has only increased since then, right? And so he's saying that this creates an atmosphere of crisis in terms of human contact with each other. Another way he characterizes this then comes in another essay from 1953, where he talks about genuine dialogue. So I'm going to move to that. That's text number 2. It is just the relation of man to speech and to dialogue that the crisis characteristic of our age has in particular tended to shatter, right? The man in crisis will no longer entrust his cause to dialogue because its presumption, trust, is lacking. The crisis of man, which has become apparent in our day, announces itself most clearly as a crisis of trust, right? So the implication for Buber of the lack of direct connection of people to each other is a lack of what he calls dialogue, which is a significant term for Buber. So if you haven't had familiarity with Buber, I'm not assuming any great familiarity with Buber, but if you do have familiarity with Buber, of course, that doesn't come as any surprise. Dialogue is a major concern of his, that is when he talks about the direct encounter of human beings with one another, he talks about this as dialogue. And that doesn't necessarily have to mean actual speaking. That is, it can be some form of encounter with the other that involves a kind of a sense of really being with someone and being connected to that person. Actual exchange of words does not have to be involved. And so what he's saying is that as these modern societies develop, there's less and less trust, and with less and less trust, there is less and less genuine encounter with the other, because you need to have the presupposition of trust in order to engage in that real sense of encounter. Now, when I say trust, I think it's an interesting question of what we mean by that, right? In other words, I don't know that what he's saying is that all of a sudden we live in a world where we're just automatically suspicious of the other. But I do think he means something along the lines of the phrase we use today a lot is comfort level, right? When you have a comfort level of talking with somebody, right? And I think what he's imagining is that in these pre-modern forms of community, that these old organic forms of life, is that people had a rapport with one another. They had a comfort level speaking to one another in a very natural, organic, spontaneous way. and they might share thoughts and feelings with one another in a more spontaneous, comfortable sort of way, and that's lost, right? In other words, and again, thinking about urban settings, right? In urban settings, you encounter many, many, many people, way more people. You encounter many more people living in a city like New York City in your daily life. You run into people, you're around many, many people, but how many of those people would you just suddenly break into a spontaneous conversation with, right? That said, it does sometimes happen, and for Buber, that's a very powerful example of the fact that we long for such connection, right? That we might spontaneously have an exchange with somebody on, say, a form of public transportation, or in the street, or at a massive gathering of people where, you know, you've all bought tickets for something, but you just end up there. You might not know the person, but you might engage them in some kind of exchange that suddenly feels comfortable. And for Buber, that's an example of how it's still possible for us to have those kinds of exchanges, and that we really long for them, and they're very important to us. And so that's what he's pointing out about modern life, about the way in which those kinds of exchanges happen much less frequently, and they're not as likely to happen without our deliberate intention of having them. And that's really what he is calling for when he's going to call for community, is we should be looking to deliberately create opportunities for that kind of human connection in what he calls community. I want to look at one more text about the crisis, and just to show you that when he's thinking about the crisis, he's also thinking about Judaism. In particular, Buber was interested in the teachings of Hasidism, as for him, the most important example of an attempt to create genuine community within Judaism. He thinks that the ideal of community within Judaism goes back to the ideals of the prophetic literature in the Hebrew Bible, the idea of the Israelites becoming a real community at Mount Sinai, or entering into the land and striving to become real community. He thinks that the Hebrew prophets were calling the Israelites to become a true community. And he sees that while Judaism maintained that ideal throughout the centuries, rarely was that ideal attempted, or rarely was that idea taken as seriously as with the Hasidic masters, right? Starting with the Baal Shem Tov in the 18th century. And so he wants to look at Hasidism, right? He's not a Hasid himself. He's not actually a traditionally observant Jew, but he wants to use the spiritual teachings of Hasidism as a way of teaching both modern Jews and non-Jews about this ideal of the realization of community. And in his understanding of it, part of what is problematic about modernity is that we lose a sense of the sacred within the ordinary daily life. So he calls this the separation of the sacred and the profane. And he sees that Hasidism, he looks at Hasidism as a way of overcoming the distance between the sacred and the profane. He sees Hasidism as teaching that the sacred and the profane should be more kind of interpenetrating, right? That it's possible to experience the sacred within the profane, within ordinary daily life. So this is what he says about that, right? The central example of Hasidism overcoming the distance between the sacred and the profane points to an explanation of what is to be understood by the fact that Hasidism has its word to speak in the crisis of Western man. Now, what he really just means there is that the thing that Hasidism has to teach the crisis of Western humanity is its central teaching, which is the overcoming of the distance between the sacred and the profane, right? Basically what he's saying in that sentence is Hasidism has something very important to teach us in this crisis of Western humanity, because of its teaching, because of our disconnection from each other, but also because of our disconnection from the sacred. So continuing on with that paragraph, he says, the thinking of the age knows how to speak about things and being in illuminating fashion, but the great insight that our relations to things and beings form the marrow of our existence seems to have become alien to life. So just to unpack what he's saying there, the thinking of our age, right, knows how to speak about things and being. In other words, we know we're very good at science, we're very good at technology, we're very good at abstract thinking. We're able to speak about things and act upon things at a kind of distance. But that's not the same thing as being in real relation, not only to human beings, but also real relation to all being in life, right? All aspects of the world around us, right? And that's that great insight of our relations to things and being forming the marrow of our existence. And he's saying we've lost that sense of that in modernity. So this is really the second factor of the crisis, is that we lose that sense of being able to have any kind of dialogue with being as a whole. So then he goes on to say, the Hasidic teaching of the holy intercourse with all existing beings opposes this corrosion of the living power of meeting as the progressive evasion before the meeting with God in the world. So basically what he's saying there in that very complicated sentence is that, and sometimes it occurs to me I may have mistyped that sentence, but then it's like sometimes it's hard to know because maybe it's just one of Buber's very convoluted sentences. But basically what he's saying there is we live in such a way as if we cannot experience God in the world, and we live in such a way as if we can't experience sacredness in the world, and we do that through this very this very common way of modern people to think abstractly, to look at the world abstractly, or in a very technological and instrumental way. But when we do that, when we think abstractly or when we think instrumentally, we are not thinking in a way that allows us to be in relation to the world and to see our world, to see our existence as a kind of sacred encounter with beings around us. And that makes it impossible for us to really experience the presence of God in the world. Or if you want to put it a slightly different way, what he means for God to dwell in the world, which is this very powerful Jewish idea that goes back to the Bible, what he means by God dwelling in the world is precisely what it would mean for us to live in a way where we encounter everyday life as a relationship and not as a form of use, right? And that's really what he's trying to teach as the central teaching of Hasidism, as the central teaching of Judaism, and also as the religious aspiration of community. So community is the way in which we as human beings live with one another in a way that moves away from those kinds of relationships of abstraction and use and into a way of thinking about each other as real people and having that kind of direct contact with each other as a way of having genuine relationships. Okay, so now we're going to go on and talk about community. And this is a very long paragraph. This comes from an essay called Community and Environment that he wrote in 1953. This is actually a preface to a book on architecture that Buber wrote. So it's just the whole essay is 3 pages. This is the one I shared with everybody. So if you want to read it later, you may get a better sense of it after discussing it now and looking at it now. That Buber is writing about how architecture and urban planning might take into account the need of human beings to have encounters with one another. And you might think of this as another way in which Buber is acknowledging the crisis of modernity without thinking that we can go back to something, right? He's not even suggesting that we sort of like get rid of modern cities. He is saying that we might want to design modern ways of living in such a way that it makes it possible for us to really encounter one another. Dare I say that this might have been something that the building committee of Anshe Chesed had discussed in thinking about its plans for a new synagogue building. I'm sure they did, in fact, think about things like this. And so for those of you who are interested in that, maybe it'll open up some discussion, but certainly you can see he's thinking more about urban planning, but you can also think about this in terms of the architecture of a community space, whether it's a community center or a synagogue. You can see the applications of that there too. But let's see what he says about this, right? So this is text number 4. The unavowed secret of man is that he wants to be confirmed in his being and his existence by his fellow men, and that he wishes them to make it possible for him to confirm them, and to be sure the former and the latter not merely in the family, in party assembly, or the public or in the public house, but also in the course of neighborly encounters, perhaps when he or the other steps out of the door of his house or to the window of his house, and the greeting with which they greet each other will be accompanied by a glance of well-wishing, a glance in which curiosity, mistrust, and routine will have been overcome by mutual sympathy. The one gives the other to understand that he affirms his presence. This is the indispensable minimum of humanity. In the world of man, if the world of man is to become a human world, then immediacy must rule between men, and thus also between human house and human house. The secret longing of man for a life in reciprocal mutual confirmation must be developed through education, but the external condition it needs in order to find its fulfillment must also be created. The architects must be set the task of also building for human contact, building surroundings that invite meeting and centers that shape meaning. Okay, so there's a lot packed in here. And I want to try to focus on 2 points, really, right? One is that Buber is making a statement about what it really means to be human, right? And that's both a statement, both in terms of what makes human beings different than other beings in the world, but also he's saying that as a kind of ethical and aspirational ideal. That is, it's not just what makes me human, it's what makes me fully human. It's about what should I be looking for in life in order to really fulfill the potential of what it means to be a human being, right? You can think about this as human beings being created in the image of God as not just a statement about what we are, but a statement about what we could be. And so when he talks about what human beings could be, he's saying that what human beings are at our best is connected to one another and engaging in this process of, or these kinds of encounters of mutual sympathy and affirmation. And what that really means, I think, affirmation gets, used, it can be a word that used perhaps not in the sense that he means, but when he says that when we affirm each other's presence, what he means is that we affirm the unique individual person that the other person is, right? That we affirm the things that make you, you, and that make me, me, that make you unique as your person and that make me unique as my person. And that's something that doesn't always happen, right? If you're in a circumstance where, people are only interested in the thing that you do at work, or the favor that you're going to do for them, or that you're paying for some, you're going to buy something in their store and they're interested in, why you might want to buy something, and what use you're going to be for them. That's not really affirming the whole person, the unique person. And that's really what Buber is talking about here, is the way in which being with other people makes my unique personality, including, by the way, many of the struggles that I might go through in life, or maybe the difficulties that I have in life, that those are heard, that those are affirmed, and that those are become a concern, right? That my concerns become the concerns of another person is another way in which my humanity is affirmed by another person. And what Buber's saying is, no matter how much we might have our own sense of our concerns and our own understanding of those of our own personality, of our own concerns, what we really long for in life is to have those concerns and to have our own unique personality affirmed or confirmed by another person, right? And then the second thing he's saying is that in order for people to be in a position, in order to have those kinds of relationships and have those kinds of encounters, we need to have a set of structures in society that at least make it possible. They don't guarantee it, but if we live in such a way that makes it harder and harder to have that kind of direct connection with one another, we won't be able to really to achieve that, right? I'm going to just briefly touch on text number 5. This comes from a much earlier piece of Buber's from 1918, where he's writing about the future of Judaism and Zionism. This is Buber less as a philosopher and social thinker, and this is Buber more as a Zionist preacher and provocateur. But what he's saying in this text shows you the way in which he thinks about this as a Jewish religious task, right? The task of creating community is not just the task of creating community, but it's also bringing God into the world. And at this particular point, he doesn't use the term Shekhinah, but he does really think about this in terms of Shekhinah. That is, the earthly presence of the divine, the Shekhinah, is for him the possibility of community. That is, bringing the divine into the world is the task of connecting with others, of having that dialogue with existence that he talked about in the context of Hasidism. So I'm just going to sort of go through this text somewhat quickly, I think, right? The divine may come to life in individual man. It may reveal itself from within individual man, but it attains its earthly fullness only where, having awakened to an awareness of their universal being, individual beings open themselves up to one another, disclose themselves to one another, help one another, where immediacy is established between one human being and another, where the sublime stronghold of the individual is unbolted, the man breaks free to meet other man. Where this takes place, where the eternal rises in the between, the seemingly empty space, that true place of realization is community. And true community is that relationship in which the divine comes to its realization between man and man. Judaism, therefore, is not concerned with a God who lives in the far beyond, for its God is content to reside in the realm between one earthly being and the other, as if they were true beam on the holy ark, nor is it concerned with a God who dwells in things, for it is not in the being of things that he abides, but only in their perfection. Okay, now a lot is being said here. I would say that to sort of summarize the main ideas, were when he talks at the beginning about how God may come to life in individual human beings, right? What he means basically is it's possible for the Spirit of God to really to be in an individual person, right? You see examples of this in the Bible where it talks about a prophet being imbued with the Spirit of God. But what he's saying is that's really not the ideal. The ideal is for ultimately all people to participate in being in real relationship to God through their being in community, right? So I think another way of putting this is that the people who are endowed with great spiritual qualities, the purpose of their having these great spiritual qualities is to help build community between other human beings, right? To share those spiritual insights so that all human beings, as he says, can experience immediacy with one another, can disclose themselves to one another, to help one another, right? Actually engaging in being concerned with another person, listening to others, right? The unbolting of the individual, right? That we shouldn't maintain our individual spheres of life, that we should become connected to one another. And that's not only the highest fulfillment of humanity, it's also the realization of God in the world. And again, going back to that idea of human beings being created in the image of God, I think for Buber, this is what really connects these two themes. That is, the purpose of humanity is to bring God into the world. So when we are at our best as human beings, we are bringing God into the world. So for Buber, in a sense, the image of God isn't just the individual image of God within us. It's ourselves as communal beings, right? And to say communal beings, and I want to be very clear about this, it doesn't mean that we lose our individuality. On the contrary, being in community for him doesn't mean giving up our individuality. It means fulfilling our individuality through our caring for others and having our individuality affirmed and taken care of by others. I have one more text that I want to make sure that I share, but I've gone through a lot, and I think we have enough people, that is a small number enough that if there are questions about particular passages, that I could open it up to questions. You just have to unmute yourself and chime in. Anyone want to ask a question? All right. I'll open up to questions in just another few minutes as well. I want to look at this story now. This is really, I would say this is probably one of my favorite of Buber's Hasidic stories. So Buber, one of Buber's major projects as a scholar and teacher of Judaism was the translation and anthologizing of Hasidic stories. It was a project that he began earlier in his career, and he kind of continued with it throughout. And he wrote a great deal on Hasidism. He's really one of the first major thinkers to bring Hasidism outside of the narrow confines of the Hasidic communities. That is, to take books that existed, some of them were published in Hebrew or in Yiddish, and to take those Yiddish and Hebrew stories and translate them into a modern German. He also edited them and sort of reworked them in various ways to make them more comprehensible, I think, to a modern audience. But some of these, but nonetheless, he tried to preserve some of the strangeness of these Hasidic stories and a lot of their spiritual power. And this was really what he was known for in Germany in the teens and 20s as this great translator and teacher of Hasidism, and it was a very influential teacher in that regard. Actually, I'd say in the 1900s and the 1910s, that was really what he was most known for before he wrote his more famous book, I Am Now, which came out in 1922, I believe. So having given you the historical background, this story is called The Counter Ruse. And it'll become clear why that's the title of the story as we go on. But so this is a story about a group of misnagdim, right? So if you're familiar with this, if you're not familiar with this, I should say, right, they're the Hasidim, who were a pietistic movement that emerged in the 19th century. And the mitnagdim were the opponents, right? These were sort of the traditional, fervently Orthodox Jews who were very deeply committed to traditional Talmudic study. And their focus, their elite rabbis were really were great scholars, were great Talmudic scholars and authorities and halachic authorities, and they were very pious and very devout, but they were perhaps not introducing the level of emotional quality or spiritual quality that was in Hasidism. And so Hasidism became very popular with the masses. And the mitnagdim or the mitnagdim, right, were the adversaries. Even though they had existed before the Hasidim, they became known as the opponents, right? So it was really, their role kind of in Jewish society changed as a result of the popularity of Hasidism. So this is a story about one of the mitnagdim, the adversaries, who comes to complain to a Hasidic rabbi, the rabbi of Rizhin. Okay, so several of them come, actually, right? So several mitnagdim, this is how the story begins. Several mitnagdim, adversaries of Sanok, came to the rabbi of Rizhin when he was passing through their city, and they complained to him. And this was their complaint. In our congregation, we pray at dawn, and after that, we sit wrapped in our prayer shawls with phylacteries on head and arm and learn a chapter of the Mishnah. Not so the Hasidim. They pray after the hour set for prayer has passed, and when they have finished praying, they sit down together and drink schnapps. And they are called devout. They're called Hasidim, right? They're the devout ones, and we are called adversaries, mitnagdim, right? So the complaint goes something like this, right? Like, we're the pious ones, like we're the ones who should be called Hasidim because we get up and we daven at the right time. And we stay, and even though we're done davening, we don't leave shul immediately, right? We stay with our tefillin and our talit on, and then we learn Torah, we learn from the Mishnah, right? So isn't that a much more valuable, a much more pious thing to do than what the Hasidim do, which is they daven late and they drink schnapps afterwards, right? that doesn't seem to be Hasidic at all, right? That's not, it seems Hasidic to us, right, in the way we think of it, right? But it doesn't seem very pious, right? So how come they get to be called the Hasidim? Okay, so this is the rabbi's answer. In Buber's telling of the story, there's actually also, there's like a joke answer that comes from one of the Rebbe's. The Rizhiner Rebbe has like an attendant who's like a jester, and he makes a joking response. I'm skipping over the joking response for the sake of this response, which I want to focus on. So the rabbi said, the truth of the matter is this. You know that ever since the day our temple was destroyed, we pray instead of making sacrifice. And just as the sacrifice was disqualified if the thought was impure, so it is with prayer, right? So in other words, you have to pray with a pure intention. That is why the evil urge devises ruse upon ruse to confuse one who prays with thoughts alien to prayer, right? So there, the evil urge is the demonic force, the demonic evil urge trying to tempt us, tries to tempt us with confusing thoughts so that we're not pure of thought when we engage in prayer. So for this, the Hasidim have invented a counter ruse, right? I'm right here. So this is the counter ruse, right? After praying, they sit down together and drink to one another to life. Each tells what is burdening their heart, and then they say to one another, may God grant your desire. And since, so our sages say, prayers can be said in any language whatsoever, this speaking and answering of theirs while drinking is also regarded as prayer. But all the evil urge sees is that they are eating and drinking and using everyday speech. And so he stops bothering his head about them. So the answer that the rabbi, the Rizhiner Rebbe gives, right, is that, so first of all, I think he may also say that, it's not here in the text, but in the version I gave you, but, we sleep in, so therefore we're not davening at the time that the evil urge is expecting us to, right? We're davening later than you'd think, right? In other words, if the evil urge says, I want to go and look for the pious Jews, the evil urge is going to get up at sunrise, right? But the evil urge isn't going to find the Hasidim at sunrise, right? Because they slept in, right? And they davened a little bit later. So that's part of the counter ruse. But then this is the part that I really love, right? Is that, so they sit down and drink right? And so the Rizhiner basically provides this beautiful spiritual understanding about what happens when the Hasidim sit down together and they drink together. And you can think about this to me is the Kiddush story, right? This is the story that explains the power of Kiddush, right? So for all of you who are, you're missing shul community, but deep down inside you think, well, what you really miss is Kiddush. And this is the story that tells you that that's actually okay. Not only is it okay, but it's actually very spiritually lofty, right? So what he's saying is that when they speak to one another in Kiddush, they have a conversation about their lives. They say what's going on in their lives. Well, this is going on. This is what's going on with my business. This is what's going on with my family. This is what's going on in my life. These are the things that worry me. These are the things that concern me. These are the things that I'm excited about. These are the things that I'm looking forward to. And they have those conversations with each other, and they say l'chaim, right? They drink, and then when they respond to one another, they say, I hope everything goes the way you want it to. I hope God grants your desire. And that, according to the Rizhiner, is the essence of prayer. That speaking to one another, that I think is what Buber means by affirmation, confirmation, mutual sympathy, right? Just the very act of listening to another person express their concerns and saying, may God grant your desire. Or in another way, we might say, I'm here for you. I hope it goes well for you. I want the thing that you want to go well, right? I'm participating in your struggle with you in some way. That's what Buber means by dialogue. It's that way of participating in each other's struggles. Even if I would say it's very important as a matter of caution that Buber himself, I think, would say this, that, we can't be too quick to believe that we understand what the other person's going through without really hearing it, right? But that challenge of really hearing it and really understanding it is part of the spiritual challenge of getting to know another person. right? And that that direct contact, that direct connection with another person, he sees that he believes that that's something that was more common or more easily facilitated in pre-modern societies. He thinks that that's a thing that we're losing in modernity. He thinks that the lack of social connection and the lack of social trust, the lack of ease or rapport that we have with one another, that's something that we're losing in modernity. He thinks that trying to create communities where we have that ability to connect with one another in this sort of way, this speaking and answering to each other, which is a form of prayer, right? That's a religious aspiration. That's the religious aspiration of Judaism, is to create real community, right? And if we get that with one another, we'll be able to bring God into the world and realize what makes us fully human. But we also have to take very deliberate steps in building community, both in the structural sense of, I would say, in the structural sense of building cities and community centers in actual buildings, but also in the formal sense, in the organizational sense, right? Like when we make times to be with each other, and make times and places and where we meet with one another, making sure that those things are conducive to actually building community. And so a lot of that is, I think, things I'd like to invite us all to think about as we're going through this time of social distancing. And I'll just leave it with this last text, which I think speaks to a lot of what we miss when we're not with one another, right? That Rabbi Pinchas said, when a man is singing and cannot lift up his voice, another comes and sings with him, another who can lift his voice, then the first will be able to lift his voice too. And again, that goes to that thing that I said before about like the people who are granted spirit, right? When you do have a person who's capable of lifting their own voice, their purpose in the world is to help others lift up their own voice, right? That's the role of leadership. That's the role of prophets and great teachers for Buber. And I would say, I dare say that we may be missing that as well in our time, right? It's harder to connect, right? How easy is it for us to have our voices lifted up by others when we're disconnected from one another in that physical presence? I hope things like this can help us do it to whatever measure they can, but it's certainly understandable that we would really have a sense of missing that in this time of what's being called social distancing, which hopefully is just the physical, as long as we need it for the sake of our health. But hopefully we can get back to being in a better place to create real community with one another. I think we have some time. If there are any questions or comments, I'd love to hear anything you want to share at this point, or just any reflections in this spirit. So just feel free to unmute and chime in, and we'd love to hear anything you might want to say.
Bill, can you hear me?
Yes.
It's Marsha.
Marsha, hi. Come on. Yes.
Hi. Well, I want to thank you for uplifting all of us in this very difficult time. My husband and I both have been listening very carefully, and I just thank you so much. I really, really appreciate it, and I feel that we've just been uplifted and also learned so much from you.
Thank you.
Wow, thank you. Okay, we have to go, unfortunately.
Okay, all right, take care, everyone. Stay safe.
Another call. Bye.
Okay, Bill, I think, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I think that one of the lovely surprises about this whole period is that Zoom really does give you the half loaf. It's not quite the same.
Yeah.
We can't hug each other, we can't shake hands, but we do see one another and we can relate. My book group, which is very close, did it via Zoom, and we all felt that we were uplifted by it. So I think it's very relevant, what you've taught us in this day and age.
I think, can you hear me, Bill?
Yes.
It's not Zoom, it's the old-fashioned telephone. We've been calling or have been called by people all over the place, friends and relatives, and reaching out to people really has made a difference, not just to us, but to the people we call, who said, oh, you remembered to call us, you thought about us. And I think that this too, it's not the same as going to visit and giving them a hug, but it is acknowledging them as other humans who also have needs and are silenced.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, in a sense, I mean, this is right. This is going to be an interesting question for me because Buber comes across as a thinker who's very concerned about the impact of technology. And I have to say, from the standpoint of face-to-face relationships, you know, I would say the last couple of years, especially with the ubiquity of you know, handheld computer devices, right, cell phones and smartphones, and the way in which they seem to interfere with human connection, right? We're opening up ways in which, and I think we're getting used to ways of using technology in ways that might promote those kinds of connections, right? And so think about, you know, think about Buber's comment about the architect, right? Well, computer programmers are architects too, right? I don't know a lot about computer programmers, but I think you can think of computer programmers as architects of a kind. And the question then is not so much technology good or bad, but the question is what kind of technology and what kind of space does technology create in order to facilitate interactions, right? And we may come to the conclusion at the end of the day that, you know, overwhelmingly we need the physical contact, we need, or not necessarily physical touch, but the physical presence of the other person in order to have a full existence, right? That predominantly that's what we need, and predominantly, you know, we already know what, you know, that children needed, and to you know, you can't be raised via Zoom. I think you can't grow up via Zoom, but that we'll also find out that there are ways in which these kinds of interactions might facilitate genuine connections with people who might not otherwise be connected, right? I think Buber, you know, I don't think Buber quite anticipated globalization, but I think there is a certain cosmopolitan element in his thought. That is, he is thinking about the ways in which we can think about all of humanity as being open to us, and we could connect to all of humanity, right? He doesn't want us to give up our particular identities, but he does want us to see the possibility of human beings being connected to each other throughout the world. I think this is just another step in that direction. But then the question is, you know, does the technology really facilitate that or not, right? And I think it's a question of how, right? Some technologies might do a better job of that than others, right? Anyone else want to chime in?